Okay, guys, so we're back now for the second part of the lecture. So, up until now, we have talked quite a bit about intercultural sensitivity and how you can develop it within the context of the year abroad, and what are the various things you guys need to look out for in terms of potential barriers or dangers or pitfalls that you might fall into when it comes to developing intercultural sensitivity. So, we then just moved on to talk about this particular model, this developmental model of intercultural sensitivity developed by Bennett, which is quite an interesting one and very useful. And I think you guys will find it quite useful in, just reflecting on the experience, even while you're there, to see how you are developing interculturally, and if there's a level of sensitivity coming out that previously wasn't the case. So, really, where did the model come from? Well, it was really developed to try and explain why people respond differently to cultural experiences. So, obviously, every individual, when involved in an intercultural interaction, will respond to that in a very different way. So, it's about trying to figure out and try to categorize how do people respond to cultural difference and what are some of the reasons behind it. And a lot of the underpinnings of the particular concepts in the model are based on cognitive psychology and are based on constructivism. So they're quite well anchored in theory and in practice. And really, I suppose what the basis of the model is that all individuals, regardless of who they are and their background and their experiences, they will follow a relatively predictable path as they gain experience with different cultures. And as they do, they move through 6 stages, increasing sensitivity to cultural difference. Okay, so as I said previously, it is a linear model, but it doesn't suggest that it is always linear, that people always progress from point A to point B to point C to point D, that there is the possibility of regression between the steps. So, a particular experience might set somebody back in terms of their intercultural sensitivity. At the end of the day, we're all human, so no one is perfect, and people will respond differently and emotionally to situations, and that can't be helped. And we know that there's been an awful lot of empirical research carried out that has demonstrated that there's a real solid grounding for this developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. So it's not just an entirely theoretical model, but it is very solidly anchored in reality. And there's been numerous reports and studies that have documented its validity and reliability. And really, what it does is, what it operates on, this entire model of development of intercultural sensitivity is really what we're trying to do, is to try and see how people attain and construe cultural difference in more complex ways. Okay, so we're trying to figure out how do people move from a situation where they maybe are less interculturally sensitive to becoming more interculturally sensitive, and understanding cultural difference in a much more complex way than was previously the case. Okay, so within the model, at both ends of the spectrum, we have on the left-hand side the ethnocentricity part of the scale, which relates mainly to a orientation towards one's own culture. And then on the right-hand side, increasing levels of intercultural sensitivity move towards what we call ethno-relativity. So the idea being that culture becomes relative, that we understand that the home culture, that our home culture is not in any way superior or necessarily inferior to any other, that it's mainly all relative, that there's just difference between them. Okay, so on the ethnocentricity side of the spectrum, what we see is that there's a strong recognition and importance of cultural boundaries. Okay, so a very strong sense that cultures are very different from one another, that there are clear boundaries between, let's say, German culture and Irish culture. What we also see on the ethnocentric side of the scale is the superiority of the home culture, or as I have in brackets here, home cultures, because certainly if you look at the Irish context, while we have a national culture, i.e. Irish, there is always a very strong sense of regional cultures, local cultures. They can also be around areas of interest. Some people might identify very strongly with particular genres of music. Some people build culture surrounding their gender identification, surrounding their sexual orientation identification. So, when we're talking about culture, it's really not monolithic. There isn't just one whole idea of culture. Rather, when we talk about Irish culture, it really is a conglomeration of lots and lots of different home cultures. But what we see in ethnocentricity is that there's a really strong sense of superiority of the home culture, okay, and that there's one true way of doing things, and that's our way. Yeah, so very common statements at that stage are, well, in Ireland we do it this way, which has a very strong underpinning of, and that is correct, the way we do it is right, whereas the way you're doing it in the other culture is wrong. Okay, so there's a very strong sense of superiority there of the home culture. And there's also a very strong lack of willingness to entertain the prospect of another norm, yeah, or another custom being potentially right. Okay, so again, I suppose this is related to the superiority of the home culture, that the norms within our culture, the customs, the values that we have in Irish culture are right, and that actually no other cultures can be right as well. Yeah, so this is kind of exclusive or exclusivity surrounding the correctness of Irish norms and customs and values as being the right ones, the correct ones, whereas others are incorrect. Okay. If we move then more towards the ethno-relative side of things, what we see is people move away from these kind of extremes of us versus them and us being superior in comparison to them, that there's a greater recognition and acceptance of cultural difference. Yeah, there's a recognition that cultures are different, ways of looking at the world are different, values are different, norms are different, and actually no one culture can tell another that they're right or wrong in the way that they do things. What you increasingly start to do in the ethno-relative phase is also you start to become more aware of the fallacy of cultural superiority or inferiority. So you start to think, I suppose, more openly, well, why would any one culture believe that they are right and everybody else is wrong? Yeah, so you start to believe that it's almost inconceivable that any one culture could act in that way, and really, it's quite a strong developmental move away from the ethnocentric side of things. Right and wrong are culturally specific and not absolutes. Yeah, so we start to realize that what we deem to be right and wrong based on our cultural lens, yeah, is not absolute, and that, what the Germans see as right or wrong, what the Spaniards see as right and wrong, Italians, French see as right and wrong, they are not necessarily absolutes, that they are culturally specific. They are culturally constructed ways of valuing certain things. And what we also start to realize at the upper end, certainly, of the ethno-relative phase is that morality is not universal. Yeah, so that something that's moral in one culture may be immoral in another culture. Okay, so that morality is not a universal construct. There's not something that all human beings can agree on absolutely everything as something is moral or immoral, but rather that one culture can construct it differently to another, and then consequently of that, nobody has the right to judge another society's customs by their standards. Okay, so onto the ethnocentric stages here, what we see is three kind of sub stages. The denial and defense stage, okay, which basically is, as we've discussed already, is this idea of simplifying and polarizing cultural difference. Yeah, so we're right, they're wrong. Yeah, and it also shows us that there's kind of a disinterest and avoidance at that stage. Okay, and what we tend to do is we tend to create dichotomies of us versus them, where we or us is superior. Okay, so there's this kind of disinterest and avoidance of things that challenge the way that we think we are right about things. Following that stage, there tends to be a little bit of a reversal. Okay, and what happens here is that people start to think, well, actually, maybe we're not right, and there's a kind of a polarization, a reverse polarization of us versus them, where the them is superior. Yeah, and it's a mirror image of the denial phase. So this is very common, for example, when people arrive in Germany and are very impressed, for example, with German culture, and they start to think, well, actually, the way they're doing things are completely right, and the way we do things in Ireland are completely wrong. Okay, so it's this complete reversal of the denial and the defense stage. And then if you move away from that towards the final kind of stage of the ethnocentric stages, we're moving into a kind of a threshold stage here, is what we're starting to do is we tend to minimize the whole idea of culture. So instead of having culture as big, exclusive, separate boxes from one another, what we start to see is that there's commonalities start to emerge and universal values that go across cultures and join cultures together. Okay, and what we tend to do at that stage is that we tend to emphasize the similarity of people and cultures. Yeah, so people will say things at that stage like, "Oh, they're just like us." They believe that this is a good way to behave and this is a good thing to do in your society, etc. Okay, so these two stages here, the reversal and the minimization, are kind of the threshold stages when we're moving towards ethno-relative, okay? When we arrive on the ethno-relative side of things, what we see is, as a kind of an initial stage, we see acceptance, okay? And we see that people start to finally accept and respect behavioral and value differences. So the way people behave and the values that people have and talk about these values is accepted widely, yeah? And that divergent cultural patterns in one's own culture and in other cultures are accepted. Yeah, so okay, they do things that way, we do things that way. No one's right, nobody's wrong. It's just different. Okay, so there's a kind of an acceptance of what's going on there. The next stage after that then is adaptation, okay, where we start to alter our perception and behavior according to the cultural context. Okay, so a very good example of this is always, for example, banter. So banter is a very strong part of Irish culture. It's a very strong part of socializing in Irish culture and identifying and social identification and that sort of thing. But, you know, we understand the more that we're in contact with another culture that may not necessarily work particularly well in that other culture. So what we do is we tend to perceive that, we see that that's not acceptable, and we adapt our behavior within that particular cultural context. And banter is certainly something that you guys will encounter as something that will more than likely change as a result of being part of German culture. You will realize that Germans do not perceive banter in the same way as Irish people, and you will have to adapt your behavior somewhat in order to be sensitive to the context. And then integration. Integration is the kind of the final stage of ethno-relativity, and it takes quite a long time to get to that stage. But really what you're doing then is you're evaluating practices around you in their particular context, and you're integrating them into yourself. So, you know, you see things in another culture that you believe, wow, that's actually something very valuable and I really appreciate that. You start to integrate that into how you start to behave and how you start to see the world. And you construct an identity that's necessarily different from the two cultures that are in interaction here. So you kind of move outside into what's called a third space, move away from Irish culture and not move into German culture, but take a kind of a third space, a kind of a third position where you can integrate elements of the two cultures into your own identity and start to construct your new self. Okay, so as I said from the very beginning, just to remember, movement through the stages is not linear, okay? So regression is possible. And, you know, can we think of some examples for this? An example, for example, might be that, you know, you're doing very well, you're having a great time in Germany, and suddenly, I don't know, you're mugged on the street by somebody from a particular culture. That kind of traumatic experience might, of course, trigger a regression, where you start to withdraw from the idea of trying to behave in a relative way towards culture and try not to judge another culture. So, you know, regression is always possible, and really what you always want to try and do is you want to try and objectify it. You want to try and realize, well, actually, this is not necessarily an example of that particular culture, so I really need to try and not hold it against that particular culture. Okay. Adaptation does not mean reducing the relevance or impact of the home culture. So adaptation, when you adapt towards another culture, doesn't mean you're losing your home culture or you're suppressing your home culture. Really what you're doing is that you're kind of taking elements of different ones and bringing them together, seeing how they work together, and trying to overcome the differences that are there. Okay, and it's as it says here, is a common for primary identity from culture one, that it can strengthen as a result of adaptation. Yeah, so you might become, and this is something we see a lot of Irish students talking about. They become more patriotic as a result of being in another culture.